Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the Innovative Findings in JIA webinar. We're going to be starting really soon, and everybody will introduce themselves and we'll explain how the evening is going to work. So can I hand over to Lucy Wedderburn?
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome, warm welcome, even though virtually, to Great Ormond Street and UCL, but also to Cluster, which is an amazing community of people right across the UK working with families affected by childhood arthritis. So we're going to show you a few of the findings that have come from this enormous and wonderful kind of multi-partner effort across the UK. You're going to be seeing 3 speakers. And of course, there's an opportunity to ask questions, and you'll hear in a little while how that's going to work and how you can ask your questions. Please do mute your own devices. Use the chat if you have any problem. We have somebody just monitoring the chat. So if you've got any technical issues, put that in the chat. Okay, perfect. And now I'd like to introduce, correct, Aileen MacDonald, who is one of our so-called champions. You'll hear a little more what are the champions in Cluster in a moment. Aileen, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to give you a really big, warm welcome to the Innovative Findings in JIA webinar. I'm Aileen, I'm one of the Cluster Consortium champions, and we'll introduce ourselves a little bit later on, but we wanted to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just a little bit of virtual housekeeping before we get going. This webinar will be recorded, and that includes the Q&A at the end as well, and both of those will be shared at a later date. Please do remain respectful in the chat, and please refrain from asking any clinical questions. We love medical research questions though, so feel free to ask away during the presentations, or at the end, whenever you have an idea, whack it in the chat. We do ask that because we've got quite a few speakers tonight, and we're doing one big Q&A at the end, if you could just write a little note as to who it's to, if it's from a specific presentation or just the name of the presentation. So at the end, when we're sorting out questions, we know who we're directing them to. And now I'm going to pass on to Lucy, who's going to tell you a little bit about Cluster.
Thank you so much. And again, welcome, and please add any comments you wish in the chat as we go along. So Cluster is now, we feel, a community. It was originally a grant, and it still thrived through that grant, funded actually by any of you who are unlucky enough to pay tax by your taxes through what's called the MRC. And we applied as a big team across the UK. Everybody who was involved in research or wanted to get involved in research in juvenile arthritis. So Cluster became much more than a grant. It became really a community. And from the beginning, we made sure that we included parents and young people who have lived experience of arthritis. And we have some of those wonderful people with us today. And we've called them our champions because they really do champion the cause of childhood arthritis. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. Let's see if this works. Aileen, I just need you to go to the next slide, please. Can everybody see the slides? Good. Okay, I can't. Good, thanks, Dario. So one of the goals of Cluster, we have many, but I thought we'd focus on this because it's core to what families ask in the clinic. And maybe many of you have asked your own doctors, is how do we know what's the right drug to use at a particular time if a child has arthritis and needs to take medicines for it? And if we knew that, could we not begin to design ways to really improve the health and the lives of children and young people with arthritis? And very importantly, also the inflammation of the eye that can happen with arthritis, which has got a long Latin name called uveitis. So this picture on the right, I hope you can see it with a lot of brightly coloured children and young people, shows you a group of children essentially coming into my clinic, but some are what I would call the red flavour, some the green flavour and some the yellow flavour. And the flavour is, if I knew it, I can't tell this colour at the moment, which drug they really need at that time. There are some who really need the red drug, there are some who might be much better on the yellow drug and some better on the green drug. But when they come to clinic, I can't tell them apart. I can't tell you by which joints are involved or how many joints are involved or when it started or what your blood work shows me. So we really need to find these things out. And at the time we started Cluster, there were really no tools to do this.
So who are the CLUSTER Consortium champions? Well, we are a fantastic group of people, even if I do say so myself, that have personal connections with JIA, whether that be as a patient, as a parent, guardian, and actually in some cases, both. But the long and the short of it is that we are people like you who live with this condition on a daily basis. We use our own experiences as well as the wider networks we're part of, the charities and communities that we work with, to be able to help direct research to what matters most within our communities. So what do we do to be a part of this research? Well, Cluster has always been very good at putting its people at the forefront of the research. So we've been very key in developing its aims, helping with ongoing research, and what I think is really important, making sure outcomes get shared in a way that our communities can understand. It's a very collaborative process. Researchers will come to us, they'll ask questions about their research, how best to go about certain things, how to develop methods maybe, how to get in touch with certain groups of people. And we do work quite collaboratively to make impactful work, whether that be looking at abstracts, infographics, presentations. And speaking of presentations, we have some really exciting research that's going to be presented to you guys today. It's a really great agenda, and Lucy's going to talk you through that now.
Thank you so much. So just before I show you the exciting agenda, I wanted to say thank you. There are probably many, many people we need to say thank you to for the last 5 years, but these people are key for tonight. So in the middle of this picture, you see our champions. There's some of them are still very much with us. Some were with us at the beginning of the journey and then moved on. So we have a bit of a rotation of people joining, and many charities are also thereby represented, and you can see their pictures below. If you have a life that is touched by arthritis in a child or young person and you're not aware of these charities, I highly recommend their websites. They've all got very useful information there. And then on the right hand side, just wanted to have a shout out for the people who've helped organize the work, the fantastic work that the champions have done. And some of you will recognize these faces on the right. So in the next slide, you will see the agenda. So I think we're running just about to time. We're going to begin with Stevie Shoup-Worrell telling us about the impact, the patterns of how arthritis goes after methotrexate. Then we're going to hear a little bit from Melissa about some blood work we've been doing to try to get a test that would help us tell which is the right drug at the right time, just when children are about to start the medicine called methotrexate. And then we're going to hear from our colleague Ram, Professor Ramanan, who is joining this evening, to tell us a little bit about how to actually improve treatments through trials. Now, there will be time at the end for questions, as we said. Please put them in the chat. If there are so many that we can't finish them all, I promise you we'll find a way to reply to them afterwards. And so with that, I'm going to pass to Emily Earle, who's here on the call. Another agenda. No.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Big thank you to Professor Wedderburn and also to Aileen for her lovely introduction. We're going to be hearing next, and I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Stevie Shoup-Worrell, who's going to talk to us about the patterns of disease impact after methotrexate. Thanks, Stevie.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephanie Shoup-Worrell, and this talk is about patterns of disease impact for children and young people after taking the drug methotrexate. So this is me. Hello. I started my PhD in 2014, and from this point onwards, I started working in juvenile idiopathic arthritis, so almost 10 years in this field now. And I'm an epidemiologist, which means I work with lots of big data from lots of children and young people from right across the country. One of the first things that I learned about juvenile idiopathic arthritis, or JIA, is just how varied the disease can be. It can affect lots of different kinds of children and young people. It can affect them in lots of different ways, both clinically and in terms of impact, such as pain, sleep issues, and worry. So even though JIA is so varied, most children and young people will start taking the drug methotrexate. And we know this treatment strategy works really well for some people. We also know that around half of young people still have what's called active disease a year after diagnosis. And you might hear the word active disease being bandied around in the clinic or in research. And this means there's still evidence that there's inflammation being caused by JIA. And the easiest way to check this is in the clinic with the doctor feeling the child or young person's joints and seeing if they still feel swollen, if they're still painful. There might be other ways, such as looking in the blood to see if there's still inflammation being shown there, or if the child or young person has a type of JIA that causes, say, psoriasis skin rashes, or enthesitis, which is inflammation of where the tendons meet the joints or the bones. These would be other ways of seeing if there's still active JIA. But we know that even in children and young people who have inactive disease, where there's no evidence of inflammation, around a third still don't feel completely better. They might still have ongoing pain, or they might still not be able to fully do the daily activities they want to be able to. And this begs the question whether there are groups of children and young people who might have different types of response to methotrexate. Some might respond really well, some's disease might not respond very well at all, and some disease might respond in completely different ways depending on what kind of JIA they have. And these children and young people might have different treatment needs. Enter the era of artificial intelligence. We've got new methods now that we haven't had in the past that might be able to uncover these groups of children and young people. It might be beyond a clinical view, too complicated for doctors to find, but we might be able to find these groups that might have different treatment needs. The first thing we need for a research study using artificial intelligence is we need data. And that comes from children and young people and their families from across the UK, part of the CLUSTER Consortium. I really like to thank those of you who've been involved in these studies. And you might enter a study when you're first diagnosed with JIA, like the study we have called CAPS. You might enter when you start on methotrexate, like a study we have called CHARMS, or when you start on a biologic, and we have some biologics registers running across the UK. When you move to an adult clinic, you do still have JIA, and it's a common misconception that once you enter adulthood, that your disease is rebranded in a way. It does not become rheumatoid arthritis or something else. You still continue to have JIA because it started in childhood. So at this point, when your medications change in adulthood, you might enter a research study then. And for the current study, we had nearly 2,000 children and young people at the point where they first started methotrexate. What did we look at? We looked at a number of different things that are important to both doctors and to young people and families themselves. Firstly, how many swollen and painful joints they had, how well the doctor thought they were, how well the young person thought they were or their carer thought they were, and a blood marker of inflammation. So we found there were 6 groups that had different patterns of disease impact after taking methotrexate. First, we had the fast improvers, about 1 in 10 young people who, after about 6 months after taking methotrexate, looked completely better. They had no swollen joints, they felt better, the clinical picture was really good. We then had the slow improvers, about 1 in 5 children and young people who got to the same point, but it took them quite a bit longer. It took them about a year until they looked and felt better. We then had two groups whose different parts of disease responded in different ways. So 8% of young people, their joints looked to be fine, no more joint swelling, and they felt a lot better. But there was something going on where the doctors didn't think they were completely better. It might have been something like a psoriasis rash or enthesitis, like I talked about earlier. We then had about 1 in 8 young people, 13%. They looked completely better to doctors. They had no more swollen joints. They had nothing else going on that we could see, no markers of inflammation. But these young people didn't feel better. They often still had pain, and they often still couldn't do their daily activities as well as they'd like. We then had 7% of young people who improved to about 6 months, and after about 6 months, they got worse again a little. And then we had just under half of young people who methotrexate just didn't seem to work for them. Their joints got a little bit better, so it affected the joint swelling, but they didn't really look better to doctors or feel better. So who was in each of these groups? We found a couple of different predictors or things that might tell you what group you could be in. We found that the younger children were more likely to be in those fast and slow improver groups, so were more likely to benefit from methotrexate, whereas the older young people and the adolescents and teenagers tended to be the kinds of young people whose disease didn't really respond as well. We found that those that felt quite well when they came to see the doctor in the first place, they tended to feel quite well all the way through. And we found that inflammation was a good predictor of whether you would continue to have inflammation later on. We also found the type of JIA, so what it's been labelled with, like oligoarticular or polyarticular or psoriatic JIA. You might have heard these. These predicted whether you were the kind of person whose disease might improve but then get worse again after about 6 months. The take homes here was methotrexate is designed to tackle joint swelling, and it does help joint swelling pretty much across the board in all groups. Some young people will improve after taking methotrexate faster than others, and some it might take up to a year for them to feel a lot better. But in 1 in 8 young people, they will look a lot better to doctors, but they won't actually feel better at all in terms of pain, in terms of function after taking methotrexate. So what do we do with this information? So firstly, it's important to note that well-being could be impacted by the drug itself. So it could be that pain has not improved, but it could also be that their side effects of the drug took a toll. And we know that nausea is a really big problem for methotrexate. But we know that children and young people whose well-being scores don't improve, even when their joints look to get better, may need different treatments or to be seen by different specialists. And what happens next? So this really helps move away from this one-size-fits-all treatment strategy towards a stratified medicine. And that's where we have groups of young people who should be treated in different ways depending on the kind of disease they have. And this research can be built upon to find which drugs a young person should take first time, whether that should be methotrexate or not.
Thank you so much to Dr. Shoup-Worrell for that fantastic presentation. Hopefully there was lots in there that is very relevant to you and your child at home. I'd next of all like to introduce Dr. Melissa Catawinata, who's going to be speaking about how she was working on establishing a screening tool to measure response to methotrexate.
Everyone, my name is Melissa Catawinata. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at UCL London. And as a postdoctoral researcher, my main role is to conduct scientific research to test on research hypotheses. And today I will briefly explain about my research, which focus on finding screening tool or biomarker for response to methotrexate in JIA. By now, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Juvenile Idiopathic Arthritis or JIA. And as we have heard from previous talks, when a child or a young adult is diagnosed with JIA, it is actually not just JIA, but the diagnosis is further categorized into different groups of categories based on their symptoms. However, despite these different categories, The initial treatment will be the same with methotrexate as their first common drug. Now, methotrexate may work on some patients, but not on others for many reasons. And for this group of patients of which methotrexate is not working, they will have to receive treatment with alternative drugs. Now, currently, we have no tools that can tell us which group of patients will receive benefit from treatment with methotrexate. This raises a question for all of us. Can we better treat children and young adults with JIA? Instead of giving methotrexate to everyone, can we identify which group of patients who will improve better with methotrexate? One way to answer the question is by establishing biomarkers that can give each JIA patient a personalized treatment. We've heard a lot about personalized treatment or personalized medicine, but what does it mean? Essentially, we categorize patients based on their specific biomarkers, and then we gave them treatments or drugs that are specific for those particular groups. So what is a biomarker then? Biomarker is an indicator that can be measured from the body, which can tell whether a drug will improve the health of a patient or not. Then the next question will be, how do we find this biomarker? This is where the involvement of patients and their parents are very important. In order to be able to find biomarkers, we need to understand what happened inside the body of JIA patients, and therefore the involvement of patients in our research is the most valuable resources. We are in a very lucky position where we can have a conversation with our patient and their family for their contribution to our research. We are able to collect precious blood samples from our patients that we would use to investigate on biomarkers. Now, how do we find a biomarker? This involves several steps and a long journey for us before we finally have a biomarker as a screening tool in clinic. We have to select samples prior to start the experiment that can help us answering research questions. And also, another important point, enough number that can give us power to do statistical analysis. Would data from 3 patients be enough, or do we need 100 patients? Statistics help us calculating this so that we can produce valid research results. After we have selected our samples, we then proceed by running the experiments, and there are many types of experiments that can be conducted. These experiments generate lots of data, and before we can analyze them, we have to make sure that the quality of the data is good enough for analysis. Once we are happy with the quality of the data, the analysis is performed, and any finding to our research question must be validated. Specifically for my research, this project took the lifespan of CLUSTER from 2018 to the current year 2024, and we are in the position where we discover a valuable finding about biomarker for methotrexate. Then, what have we done and what have we discovered so far? After we took blood samples and processed the cells, we then sorted the cells and proceed with sequencing analysis. This analysis allows us to find a set of genes that were linked to how well the patient responded to methotrexate. We discovered a specific link between a set of genes that involve in something called the interferon pathways and methotrexate response. We found that patients with a high score of this interferon or interferon score would respond better when they receive methotrexate treatment. Now you might wonder, what is interferon? Interferon is a natural molecule within body that helps immune system to fight, or as the name, interfere against infections such as viral infections. Therefore, interferon plays an important role in regulating inflammation within body. And we know that inflammation is the key event in arthritis. So this finding is very exciting because this is the initial step towards finding appropriate biomarkers for personalized treatment in JIA patients. Does it mean we have found a biomarker for methotrexate response as a screening tool? For us to be able to use it in the clinical settings as a screening tool, we need to validate our findings and make sure that our finding is robust. Meaning that we have to be able to repeat our analysis and find same, if not similar findings with different samples from different group of patients. We then need to validate our findings in the clinical lab and make sure that the test can be performed as simple and as easy as possible as a clinical lab test. Once the biomarker has been validated in the clinical lab, then they can be used as a screening tool by clinicians to treat JIA patients with methotrexate or other alternative drugs. And that is our aim, of which we want patients to be treated better in the future. All this sounds straightforward, but these processes will take a good amount of time before we can finally see it in practice. Nevertheless, we are at a stage where we have results from our research, and we will continue with our validation, and hopefully we can achieve our final goal soon. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and very happy to take questions later. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to Dr. Katarinata for that presentation, and thank you also to those of you who are putting some questions related to either that presentation or the previous one in the chat. We really welcome any questions that you have. We'll get through what we can this evening, and we'll definitely reply with answers in another form if necessary to those that we don't have time for. If for any reason you're finding that the chat isn't working for you, we can also take questions on email. You can email CLUSTER Consortium, all one word, at ucl.ac.uk. That's CLUSTER Consortium, all one word, at ucl.ac.uk. So we'll add those questions into the mix. Thank you so much to Dr. Katarinata. Next up, we've got Professor Ramanan, who's going to be speaking about the journey from diagnosis to cure, the magic word there, and how we're working on improving the treatment landscape.
Thank you very much to all the cluster champions and to Eileen and the other cluster colleagues who have organized this evening with all the families and all of those gathered. My apologies that I couldn't be here to answer this in a live fashion, but it gives me great pleasure to address all of you, and I know most of you are incredibly interested from a personal note in how we move from diagnosis of arthritis to curing arthritis. And my advance apologies if some of the language is a bit more medical, but I'll do my best to deconstruct it. Where we want to go for most of you, for your particular children, is really moving from the current model, which is to control the inflammation and deliver the best care for these children so that they can do everything they want to do, to a model where we actually cure the arthritis so that they don't have to take daily medications or weekly medications. So this is an incredibly complex slide, but is illustrating that in the last 50 years, we've moved and made significant progress in the amount of medications that are available to treat children. Most of these are initially trialed in adults, and some of these never make their way into children. Be that as it may, in 2024, there is an incredible array of drugs which are available to treat children. However, what is sorely lacking is not knowing which drug is the right drug for your child, which of these drugs is better than the other, which of these drugs is safer. To do these sorts of studies, we need really head-to-head studies where the drugs are compared against each other, something to date pharma has been unwilling to do, although through Cluster we've been working very closely in trying to persuade them that this is the way forward. The absence of this sort of data means we can't address some of the key questions that many of you ask us in clinic, the right drug for your child at the right time, and to minimize the key side effects. When we did a huge meeting between the regulators such as FDA, European Medicines Agency, MHRA, the parents, the families, the clinical academics like myself and industry, the key issues that you highlighted to us was that the lack of head-to-head studies, that some of the study designs which have placebo are really not appropriate, and that some of the outcomes that are meaningful for the clinicians or for the regulators are really not meaningful to you, and about really the ethical considerations of the current trial design. And so we have solutions. We're working hard with industry, as I said before, and with regulators so that we can have head-to-head studies, we can have outcomes which really are meaningful to you, which look at aspects such as pain and fatigue, having study designs which enable everybody to get an active drug and yet get the greatest information needed. And in all of we want to move away from the current model of controlling the inflammation, treating the disease, to a place where we can cure this illness, like we do when you have a bug and we give you an antibiotic, or like we're trying to do in cancer medicine. And we want to do this, and this diagram illustrates what many of you may have experienced with your children, which is the recurrent flares, the failure of certain medications, the constant switching between one medication to another, either because of the lack of effect of the medication or because of the safety profile of the medication and the side effects that the child experiences. So really, there is a momentum building towards the cure agenda, for which we really need to understand the underlying mechanisms of disease better so that we can move towards. Of course, working with all of you champions has enabled us to make significant steps in this path. Here are two examples. One is to illustrate how complex the drug development pathway is, which is going to be increasingly helpful in discussions with families, with regulators, and with industry. And also a piece which was done by the Cluster Champions and published in Lancet Rheumatology, which really spoke about the need for innovative trial designs and better trial designs that meet the needs of the patients, the families, and the clinicians. So we will work on this agenda towards a cure for arthritis. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm sure I will be able to address questions through Eileen, or if you reach out to us through Cluster. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor. Oh.
No, go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you so much to Professor Ramanan. We're really grateful for his time in putting forward that presentation, just giving a little bit of the outline of the landscape of how the trial situation lies at the moment. I'd like to hand over now to two of our champions, Kath and Debbie, who are going to chair the questions and answers that have come in the chat and that have come in the email and that were submitted before the actual webinar began. So over to you, ladies. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily, and thank you to all the speakers. So we've got some questions in the chat. We've got the majority of the speakers here this evening to answer the questions apart from Professor Ramanan, but everyone else is here and will be able to answer the questions. So I'm going to start with the first question. Where does all the research we've heard about tonight actually take place? And I'm going to ask you, Lucy, to answer that one, if that's okay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Well, the work that you've seen has taken place across the UK, largely in hospitals who care for children with and young people with arthritis, and university laboratories attached to them. But what we've done in Cluster is try to kind of maximize what there is in the UK by sharing and using the best of what everyone has to offer. So, for instance, Stevie, as you heard, is now an expert in machine learning, and with all of your and other families' permissions, we were able to share data so that the person who was doing machine learning could use all the possible data for that. And similarly, Melissa, who you heard, is an expert in the lab, and she was able to use blood samples that were stored, some of them quite a long time ago, from different patients to do her experiments. So it's about partnership, just like our partnership with the champions. It's also partnerships between hospitals and universities. And that's helped a lot, actually, by the government, because they fund ways for us to work together. And that's incredibly important. And of course, it's most benefited by the fact that families are willing to be in these studies. And like Melissa said, we couldn't do any of this without that.
Great. And I think, Debbie, you're going to ask the next question because it's actually your question. So that's going to work very well.
Sorry, just so we don't get feedback here. Sorry, but cool. Yeah, so I suppose it's probably to Lucy. In the presentation we had kind of talking about the stratified medicine, when do we actually think it will be used in clinic rather than generically giving methotrexate as that first treatment?
Think no, leave. You don't. They don't need to see me twice. Can you hear okay, Emily? Yes.
Yeah.
I think actually you'll be surprised to hear that in some ways we've bits of medicine for a long time. So if you or your child has systemic JIA we already know that it's probably not worth trying methotrexate because the majority of those young people who won't get well enough.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Lucy. You're very quiet.
I could do it in that type of arthritis. This is quite an extreme form. Those children were very poorly, and that helped us to group those patients together early with the rest of arthritis. Some of the things that Melissa's shown you become a reality. I've got one example from my career. We found a test that helps me tell if when you stop methotrexate, arthritis will come back. And in the old days, I had to say it's about a 50-50 chance of that happening. And now I do have a blood test that helps me tell who's most likely. That, from discovery to clinic, took 9 years. It's a long time. You have to make sure your results are right. What Melissa said, something called validation. And then you have to.
Can you mute yourself?
Emily, were you hearing that answer?
Sorry, no, that was breaking up a
Can't
bit,
hear
Lucy. We
Emily
do have
now.
plenty of time, actually. We're a little
Okay.
ahead.
Sorry, did you hear that answer?
No, it was breaking up, and I think lots of people weren't able to hear. We do have plenty of time, so if you're able to share again, that would be fantastic.
Okay. Do you want me to start? I'll start very briefly with the example of systemic JIA, where the fact that systemic arthritis is so severe and the children are so unwell when they first come and they have some very dramatic features, rash and fever, meant that that type of arthritis, I think, got stratified medicine a little earlier than others. So we already have 2 or 3 medicines that we go for very early in that kind of arthritis. And those children, in a way, have the best kind of biomarker because we can see it as the child comes in. We don't have to do a blood test. We know how to recognize systemic JIA. But the ones that Melissa spoke about are much more challenging. They're more like each other at the beginning. So I think stratified medicine probably takes 5 to 10 years for most discoveries to then become real in the clinic. But one of the ways that we're ahead in JIA is what Melissa showed you. So nowadays, studies are willing to share data. So Melissa was able to look not only in the cluster children, but then in other children from another study of one of our 2 other studies of our collaborators. And that speeds things up. So the more patients are willing to be involved in research, the quicker we will get to personalized medicine.
Thank you, Lucy. So I'm going to move on to the next question. So the next question is, did you measure the percentage of young people who later went into remission after taking methotrexate? And that's relating to Stevie's presentation. So Stevie, are you happy to answer that?
Yeah, I'm here. You see me? My spotlight is enough?
I can see you now. Brilliant.
Fabulous. So it really depends what you mean by remission. And that's the problem, isn't it? If we're talking about clinically, you look better, you've got joints that look great, you know, from a doctor's perspective, you look fabulous, then maybe half of the kids that are on methotrexate seem to look completely better. If we're talking about you feel completely better, that's a little less. It's about 2 in 5 young people, but those may not be the same group. So it's a really challenging one, and it's why it's so important that we figure out who should have methotrexate and who should have other different kinds of treatments that may not even be drugs, so that everything can be controlled together.
Perfect. Thanks, Stevie. So next question, how can I put forward my son's case of systemic JIA for research purposes, as they feel his case and blood markers were very significant and unusual? And I'm going to ask you to answer that, please, Lucy.
Okay, well, in our ideal world, every child and young person with JIA would have the opportunity to be in research. Most hospitals in the UK that look after children and young people with JIA are part of some study or other. So the first thing to do is ask your team, ask the clinical nurse specialist or your doctor, or ask them to give you contacts of people who know. The second thing to do would be to check out some websites. And after the webinar, we'll add, for instance, Kath runs a very wonderful summary of studies that are going on at the time that we can share, and Eileen can let you know those. I think you have to be quite bold and say you very much want to contribute to research if that's what you want to do. So really don't take no for an answer and keep asking, and there definitely are opportunities for everyone to be involved.
Thanks, Lucy. So the next question then is a question for Ram, which unfortunately I think we should leave to later on unless you feel you can answer that.
There we go.
Brilliant. Okay, so Lucy's going to answer this one. Why is there a reluctancy in comparing the different medications?
So very sadly, you remember in Cabaret, money makes the world go round. It's partly about money. So companies who make a drug would like to do a trial that shows that that drug is good enough to be given permission by, the authorities to sell their drug for that disease. So they would prefer to compare that medicine to no medicine at all, or a so-called placebo, a dummy drug, because it's easier that way to show that it works. It's a big risk for them comparing two medicines, because what if the other one was better and they kind of wouldn't win? Now, we are getting around this now. We're no longer only doing trials with companies, and we're not using dummy drugs much anymore in trials for children. And we have clever statistical ways of doing clinical trials in ways that mean we don't have to use dummy drugs. But the real reason is that the company has to continue to make a profit. I'm sorry to bring money into it, but one of the drivers are the people who own the company through shares, and shareholders have to make a profit. So they're looking for a way to get a license for the drug, because that means they can sell it.
Okay, thanks for your honesty there. That's okay. So the next question then I think is for you, Melissa. So regarding the interferon biomarker, did you see any trends in the levels versus the subtypes of arthritis?
Good question. You can talk, they'll pick you up.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Really interesting, and also it's something that we've been looking at as well. But as far that we've seen in our data, there's no correlation or there's no specific differences between subtypes to their interferon levels. But we also have to take in mind that our cohort, even though it's already big as it is for JIA, is not big enough to make it for us to be able to subset it per subtypes. So again, back to the presentation, statistics is very important. Power of number is also needed for us to be able to do the testing based on different subsets. But based on our data so far, there's no differences, or there's no correlation between the subtypes to the interferon.
I guess it's worth saying, Melissa, that now you've found that, somebody else could test that hypothesis because they know what to look for. So They don't need 5,000 patients anymore.
Yeah.
It's the needle in the haystack story. This is now the needle. So they have the magnet. They know how to measure interferon. So we could do that study now that we know what to look for. Exciting.
Thanks, Melissa. So next question, when should a review of medication be undertaken as you become an adult, especially if you've been on the same medication for several years? Lucy?
Okay, in general, we are not going to use the webinar to go into kind of personal clinical questions, but I'm very happy to answer this one, if you like, quite generally. Is that okay?
Yeah, general's fine.
I think it will depend how you are and how your doctor and the team at your new hospital, if you've moved to a hospital looking after young adults, feels you're getting along. So for instance, if the blood tests are a bit unusual, they might consider a review. Obviously, if your arthritis comes back, very importantly, if they remember to look in your eyes, because even young adults with JIA still need their eyes checked, that might prompt them to think, oh, is a different medicine needed? But there are plenty of young people, and we have colleagues in Manchester looking at exactly this, who stay on a medicine for many years as a young adult and are just fine. And they're the lucky ones in a way. They've found a medicine that works for them. So I think there's no one size fits all for this. It will depend how you are, how your blood tests look, how the other markers that they can measure of your well-being are as to when a medication is reviewed.
Thank you. Okay, moving swiftly on then for the machine learning approach. I think this is over to you again, Lucy, or Stevie. Will we give it to Stevie?
Yeah.
Maybe you're lucky. I imagine the data needs to be big enough for the model to learn accurately. How far are you on collecting the data from the patients until we have a significant amount of data? And is there any current benchmarks you can share?
That's the question, isn't it? A tricky one, because these methods are all so new. We don't really know exactly how many we need to be able to say, okay, this is the answer that applies to everyone. What we can say is we have so much data in Cluster and that we have from around the UK that we can find the big things. So the things that are going to affect lots of children and young people, we can find those ones. And it's just the things that affect a smaller number or a smaller group, they're much harder to get at. And we actually might not even have enough children and young people in the UK to find those answers. And so what we actually need is lots of international collaboration going worldwide, working with other researchers and other patients and young people across the world to be able to actually find these answers that can benefit everyone.
Thanks, Stevie. Okay, so a question from Lynn. How can families get involved in studies and find out more about the study outcomes as they progress?
Do you want to take that one, Kath? Kath is a bit of an expert on this topic.
That's not
or I can if you like.
No, what I am going to share is I was part of a consumer group in the clinical studies group for pediatric rheumatology, and we thought it would be a really good idea to have a one-stop shop where you can find out all the studies that are happening across the UK with contact details of everybody. So Debbie is going to put the link to that in the chat. In fact, she's already done that, so you can find out about the different studies that way.
And the other things you can do, all of the charities we showed you at the beginning, which should come up through Google as childhood arthritis, also have links to research. Yes. Probably slightly different ones, but that would, give you a happy day of Googling. And like I said to the previous questioner, I think actually ask your clinical team, are you involved in research? If not, do you know of other research studies that I can be involved in, even if it's not at this hospital? Mm-hmm. Because we've just come back from a meeting in Europe, thousands of pediatric rheumatologists and their teams from all over the world. And so almost all pediatric rheumatologists will know about research that's going on and might be able to give you those signposts.
And I think a very important one is for us all who are involved and work with families to just keep encouraging them to ask questions, come to us, get involved, and together we will be stronger. So next question, for the interferon biomarker presentation, did you notice a certain demographic of people to have a higher interferon score? Melissa?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. We've looked into this before and we take into account the demography or the ethnicity in this case, along with the other variables in our analysis. And as of now, we don't see any strong effect from all of these variables as of yet. So the strongest effect that we've seen is purely on the outcome that they have or response to methotrexate with the interferon.
But it's a brilliant question. We have a very smart panel of questioners on tonight. And I do want to share with you, we know that even healthy boys and girls can differ in their interferon, especially during puberty. And maybe that's why older men got more sick with COVID than older women. Because we make a nice lot of interferon. And that might be partly why arthritis is more common in girls than boys.
Interesting.
Not the whole reason.
Okay, so next question. What do you think the future will be in terms of relationships between research and the community?
We really hope it will continue to grow. I think in Cluster, we've tried to be as diverse in every sense of that word and inclusive as possible. And now we're often asked to talk to others about those ways of working. There are some funny people out there in the world, not anyone who's on this call, who think it's difficult to involve children in research. I don't know where they got the idea, but it's clearly not true. So we work hard to keep saying children and young people must be involved in research. And also these fantastic champions have actually written, you'll be absolutely stunned, several research papers which get a lot of attention and interest. And so the message is out there now, and we very much hope that connection between the community and research will just continue to be strong.
Thank you. So next question, is there any additional information any one of you can share about uveitis?
Oh, this would be a whole other webinar. We've got incredibly exciting things happening about uveitis. Partly Cluster has been the platform, the springboard for a UK uveitis wide, a uveitis UK-wide community. Some of those investigators are in Bristol, some are here at UCL, some are in Manchester, some are in Liverpool. And there's a plan to bring them together to really right through from basic science through to clinical trials. There are 2 ongoing new clinical trials in uveitis that the UK is part of, and more are planned. So things have never moved faster than now for uveitis of JIA. Still, there's quite a lot we need to find out. There's still a lot to do.
There's a lot to do. Really good question here from Rob. How do you think the UK studies, or how do the UK studies, sorry, link in with the international studies?
Well, we link in all the time, to be honest, Rob. We must do that. I feel it's our kind of philosophical duty because JIA is quite rare compared to some conditions. And as Melissa said, we always need to check our results in another group. So we have strong connections with the US, with Canada, with Germany, with Utrecht, actually with Australia now. The list is long. And we do that partly because we're very communicative around the world and we link up. So for instance, I know that one of our charity members is linked to the equivalent in Canada. So it's not only the research, it's also the families and the parents. The limit is always it's quite expensive to do international studies. For various sort of logistic reasons. So you do need grant money. Even to share the data is a huge task because of the legal barriers to that. So you can all help us with that. So more work, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But you can shout loud that families with JIA want research to be allowed to be outside one country and maybe bring some of those barriers down a little bit. That would be so great.
That would be great. So the last few questions here, how often will you hold these cluster meetings? I'm going to let you answer that, Lucy.
Yeah, so we're actually all coming together with everybody who's been doing the research in November. And of course, our champions will be invited. And that's one of the questions on the agenda. First of all, we'd like to get your feedback because we want to be sure, was this useful? Was it too long, too short? Was it about right? And although we can't actually see you or chat to you, does it feel like useful information? And if that comes back positive, I think there'll be real energy to run another. And I would think there'll probably be once or twice a year max. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So at the CCAA Family Weekend, we heard of studies linked to JIA and gut health. Is this something you're including in your study?
Yes, and one of our new future leaders, you can look forward to a bright future, is writing the first analysis of exactly that study, which included 100 young people who were so kind to give us a sample of their poo. And that was incredible. Everybody said, oh, nobody will join that study. Teenagers will hate you. They were so wrong. Teenagers wanted to be in that study. And we're going to collect more data. You need huge amounts of data for that study. But there's a lot of evidence now from other places that we can sort of borrow, even from models in the lab, about diet and how it influences your gut health and how that relates to JIA. So watch this space. That is definitely coming.
Okay, we've got the reminder 3 minutes from Eileen here, yes. So I think we've got time, hopefully, for one more question. Is there going to be more research around systemic JIA and the link to it still being called Still's disease?
Yes, and in fact, there's an international group has just reported saying really it's the same disease as what we call adult onset Still's disease. And they had a huge meeting in America, I think a year ago, and we could send you that link if you'd be interested. I think there are 2 camps, people who still want it called Still's from 2 to 92, and people who want to remove the name of George Frederick Still. Here I have to declare a conflict of interest. He was a registrar here at Great Ormond Street, so we hold his name fondly in our memories. But I understand people who don't like the term Still's disease. One day it'll probably go.
Eileen, do we have time for one more question, or is that a firm no? Oh, one more. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so are there any studies linked to JIA outcomes relating to lifestyle diet?
Many. It's not my area of expertise, but diet we've put into, of course, the gut health study, many related to lifestyle. I wonder if, Stevie, you'd like to come in and have a thought about that question.
You know, this is actually a really interesting one because I was at PRES, our international conference, last month, talking to several dietitians about setting up a new diet study, because we've got all this new technology that we could use to track diets. And it may be that there's no one size fits all. It may be that there's not a specific diet that helps JIA, but it may be that it's personal to each and every young person. And if we could track that, it may be that you find something that works for you. And I think this could be a really important big study. So if anyone wants to come and chat to me about that, I think that would be great to set up.
Stevie, absolutely brilliant. And make sure you reach out to Lizzie, because she would have very useful insights. It would be like the Zoe app for JIA.
Oh, yeah, watch this space. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions, and any questions that we haven't answered, that we haven't just had time to answer, we will absolutely answer through email. So just to finish us off, I'm going to hand over to Kerry, another of the cluster champions.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited about a Zoe app for JIA. It sounds fantastic. And thank you so much for all of your amazing questions. Thank you so much again to all of our speakers and all of the cluster champions and the consortium. It's been so great to all get together, and it would be really, really helpful to us if you would fill in the feedback form, and that gives you an opportunity to ask any further questions as well. But this is something that we would like to continue to do. So you can scan that QR code there, and then that will give you a link to the feedback form. But also we will be emailing that out to you all as well. So any feedback at all would be extremely helpful. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you found it useful, and we hope to see you all again, and so that you join part of the cluster family. Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Is everyone gone?
I'm hoping Emily and Kerry will stay on, so we can just touch base.
And Aileen?
No, there's lots of people. And is Aileen on?
Yeah, Aileen's still on.
And Zoe's on.
And Zoe's on.
Zoe, say hi.
Hello.
Hello. Zoe.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. All good. Great webinar.
Oh, Aileen,
okay. Hang on one sec. She's going to stop the recording. Dario, are you able to stop the recording so that this bit then doesn't go out to all of our participants, and then we can chat?